Cool. So thank you very much for attending. I'm Jan Michalevsky, co-founder of Cryptosat. And I'll be talking about satellites and how they provide the perfect air gap for protecting wallets and transactions in MPC scenarios, but not limited. So let's dive into it. I'll run through the whole presentation, and then let's take questions. So in terms of the mission statement of the company, we essentially build what we call the trust infrastructure for Web3, and we do it in space. And I'll dive into what it means with the focus on what's relevant for this audience, which is wallet SDKs and companies. And just to give you a taste of how things, some of the things look behind the scenes and some of the background of the founding team. So that's a photo on the bottom left of Jonathan Weintraub. He's my co-founder, and he's our space person. He's coming from an aerospace background. Most notably, he founded an organization previously called Space AL. That sent a spaceship to the moon in 2019, crash landed in 2020. If you're crashing a party, you still have a good time. So that was the first time a non-government organization, basically a private mission, sent a spaceship to the moon. And above that, you see an experiment with agriculture, growing chickpeas in space, a photo of the backside of the moon that they've taken. It's not actually a dark side, because it's not dark. It's just the backside of the moon, what you call the dark side normally. So that's a little bit about the team. What we see here is footage of the launches of the two launches of our first two satellites. Let's take a peek. That's on Falcon rockets produced by SpaceX. We're launching with them from Florida normally. You can see the first stage coming back. And you can see the satellite, the platform that releases the satellites being released there. So that's a summary, and on the right here, that's footage of the launch of our second satellite, Crypto 2. So that basically, that's some of the milestones we achieved from this perspective of launching actual payloads into space that enable us to POC, experiment with different things. Just diving a little bit into how it looks like and how the payload looks like. So that's what's called the CubeSat. Here on the left, we can see what's called the 3U. So 1U is the standard small unit that you can compose multiple times, producing in different formats of CubeSats. And what's nice about it, it's kind of a standardized format that enables you to build and assemble satellites pretty affordably. And it's also like a standard unit that you can place onto rockets, and that basically creates an industry standard such that the launching companies can anticipate the type of the payload, its structure, and that enables to basically onboard many different companies that produce satellites with affordable costs. And you can see this stack of boards. Some of them are related to controlling the satellite, orienting it, transmission. And some of them are what we call the crypto cards. That's basically where we run our cryptographic logic. And that's the actual business logic that enables us to do what we do as a company and serve our customers. On the right side, super simplified view of what we're doing in terms of providing APIs that are convenient to use, REST APIs that enable us to enable end users to communicate with our satellites, and that connects on the back end to ground stations. We don't need to own and operate the entire ground station ourselves. We can work with partner companies and even things like AWS ground station offerings to actually communicate with our satellites. But we do provide security and integrity along the way by encrypting, doing authenticated encryption over all the communication. That's an example of a tracking interface where we can see where our payloads are at any moment. And we also, in terms of enabling developers to easily on board and explore what Cryptosat provides, we build what we call CryptoSim, the Cryptosat simulator, that essentially enables us to explain different use cases, showcase the APIs, or how a similar actual production API would look like, explore it in a sandbox environment, and have an actual JavaScript sandbox when you can try those things out. So that's online. In terms of some of the milestones, we started with doing some experiments aboard the International Space Station first to see how, from an operational perspective, we work with space. And I mentioned Zengo there, so one of the companies that attended this conference. That was an early experiment we did with cosigning transactions, with multi-sig transactions for Bitcoin in space. Since then, we launched 2 satellites, with the most recent satellite being launched in earlier in January this year. Did an additional experiment aboard the International Space Station. We also participated in the setup in the KZG ceremony run by Ethereum, where they have this highly decentralized setup for setting up polynomial commitments for the sharding. So we were part of the special contributions phase. And the premise is essentially producing cryptographic parameters as part of this trusted setup that are guaranteed to not be tampered with in any way, because the environment that produces them is basically outside of any physical reach, and nobody can tamper with that. And I want to dive into the part that's specific to what I wanted to talk about today, that's more relevant for this audience, which is securing wallets and transaction cosigning from space. So I took Jonathan Katz's one of his slides from yesterday, where basically he was talking about holding private key shares, the concerns around that, holding private key shares in one place, or even if you decentralize it within a single company, what could be the risks of that. And what we're doing, in a nutshell, really, kind of simply put, is basically taking one of those nodes and running it on a satellite. So basically, one of the key shards moved to space with the idea to protect it to such an extent that even a very powerful attacker that has physical access is prevented from using this kind of vector. So that's where Cryptosat comes in, by becoming one of those cosigners as part of an MPC protocol. So let's talk a bit about that. So essentially, in terms of the flow of the data, it looks like that. You have a user that wants to sign some transaction, wants to move assets or funds or any other operation that requires signing. And you have some sort of an MPC coordinator. It can be different for different protocols, but basically I'm folding into that the part that coordinates all of the logic and communicates with different signers to obtain the different signature shares, combine them, and then post them on the blockchain. So as part of that, it would communicate potentially with some other ground infrastructure, something that maybe the company is running on its own to cosign a transaction. Maybe part of the signature is provided by the user itself using their key share. But another part of the signature would be provided by Cryptosat. And in a way where even we cannot really tamper with it, because the keys are solely stored in space on the satellite and are never exposed to the ground infrastructure. And that can happen in 2 ways. We can either generate the keys from the get-go in space. If it's an MPC scheme, that might be done through a DKG protocol, the centralized key generation that the satellite will take part in. Or we can store an existing key shard that the user will upload in encrypted form to one of the satellites. And from that point on, the satellite wouldn't give it away to anybody. So in this case, you might want to simplify the setup by generating everything on Earth first, splitting the key, uploading the key shard, and then destroying any remaining data so that nobody can recover it. So that's another option. And the other part the satellite does, or different satellites do, is signing the transactions using those key shares upon request. So then they basically provide the partial signature share that's combined with the rest of the signature shared, and then the transaction, a compatible transaction, can be posted on one of the blockchains. So, for instance, that I'll dive into what exact experiments we did with that and our POC with defense, but we actually created the Bitcoin-compatible transactions with that. Let's look at the benefits of that and also some potential caveats. So the main benefit is basically preventing stealing the key share. And now, like, a good question to ask here is, okay, I cannot steal the key share, but I'm using an API that enables me to sign. So what if I can authenticate to this API by stealing the credentials that enable me as an attacker to request those signatures? That's a good point. That still remains a valid concern, and those credentials should be secured. But what it does provide, it provides a very clear cut regarding the impossibility of circumventing this kind of an API and signing transactions, forging transactions somewhere else. And that enables to basically enforce policies and do some auditing and logging of those any transaction that takes place, potentially delaying some transactions or applying specific policies to transactions that involve very high amounts that are more risky. So even if an attacker obtains those kind of credentials, some policies would be applied, or at the least, you will for sure know that it took place because of the audit log that's produced by the cosigner. And of course, that all assumes that the API is secure. There are no obvious software bugs that can be exposed remotely. So that's another part that whoever implements it, which in this case, it's us together with our partners or the MPC scheme deployed. It assumes their security, but the clear kind of guarantee it provides is regarding the physical access and any possibility of extracting data, keys from memory, or using any side channels that are available through that kind of access on the ground. We call this kind of thing, we sometimes refer to it as a warm wallet. Basically, looking at the options you have with signing on the ground, you either have a hot wallet that's up and running, stores the keys in storage or very accessible memory, and is more exposed to different attacks, or you're really safeguarding your key in a cold storage, whether it's a backup or something like a vault where you occasionally need to access it, but it's a very inconvenient option because you wouldn't want to access this cold storage frequently. So we provide something in between in terms of, or potentially more secure than this cold storage by placing the key share out of any reach, which is way more secure than a hot wallet that can be exposed to different attacks. But on the other hand, it still has this API that is potentially more convenient than a cold storage on the ground that you need to access manually if you want to recover the key. So that's another benefit. I talk about the possibility of stealing API credentials. So again, that's something that needs to be taken care of, but it prevents the attacker from covering its track while doing this kind of attack. Some of the guidelines around such deployments as we're working with our partners, and they might change down the road. But at this point, we do recommend to have a cold backup for those keys because space is not a trivial environment. There's, for instance, things like cosmic radiation, which can affect the data you store there. So we take multiple measures to prevent those kind of things. For sensitive pieces of data, we store them multiple times. Think of it as like a version of RAID. We can do error correction. But it's still sort of the beginning of the journey, so we want to be on the safe side, and that's where a cold storage, cold backup can make sense to ensure that if something happened to a satellite, you can still recover the keys, but at least you don't have to expose those keys on some infrastructure that's up and running and is accessible to the internet. You can like really put it in the cellar in a very secure storage and only access them if a disaster happens. So that's one recommendation at this point. We didn't see so much, we didn't really see loss of data so far with our satellites, and one of them has been up and running for quite a while. So some of the things are making us very optimistic about the possibilities of potentially providing a full storage solution for this kind of data on satellites. And as I mentioned, protecting the API credentials that enable you to access this API to request signing. I want to go back to the milestones with an emphasis on what we did for wallets and protecting and cosigning transactions. So as I mentioned, early on in March 2022, we did an experiment on board of the International Space Station. And then we used just normal multisig. It wasn't threshold signing, just a normal Bitcoin multisig to create, to post transactions. And that was done in cooperation with Zengo's research. After we launched 2 of our satellites, we were able to progress to actually testing it on one of our own satellites versus the International Space Station. And that's where we were working and still working with the defense labs. Their wallet solution, they're in SDK for institutional wallets. So basically together with them, we deployed their implementation of the Frost threshold signature scheme. Optimized for this kind of setting. Basically, they did some extra work on optimizing the Frost scheme such that it minimizes the number of rounds that are needed for this setting, because communication with space is not as trivial as talking to a regular server nurse. So you want to potentially incur less bandwidth and less communication rounds with the satellites if you can. So this kind of optimization was very helpful. So we deployed that, and we ran the POC for that in June earlier this year. And using the Frost threshold signature scheme, we produced a Bitcoin compatible transaction that we could then post on the blockchain. So that's a more recent development. And some of the findings and the explanation of how we use Frost and the specifics of deploying it on the satellite is also available in this write-up called the Space Wallet. That it's not yet published, but it's basically available per request, and there we summarize the findings. I want to talk about some potential additional benefits of satellites in this setting beyond what we already did. And some of them are more related to things around key recovery or other benefits of space. So something we call logbox, or which is essentially key recovery, is basically the potential of using this kind of environment to safeguard a key for a scenario where you either lost it or lost access to it, or the machine that you were storing your key on for your daily operations is bust. There was, I don't know, fire in your house, and you cannot recover the key. So basically, having some environment that will, upon certain triggers or conditions, deliver the key back to you. Crypto wheels is something kind of related to that, but it's for a specific scenario. So actually, Uriel, I think, was mentioning something related yesterday. In the case, for instance, that a company disappears, is being acquired, some change that basically prevents you from accessing your keys as you would do normally, you potentially want some black box that would release it, regardless of how it works, it will release it upon some conditions to a certain party you trust. Or for instance, why is it called crypto wheels? Because if somebody passes, you want some assets to move to a trusted contact. So one scenario for one implementation of that could be something that receives a keep alive signal occasionally, and that prevents it from releasing the key. But if it didn't see this keep alive signal for a while, it will release the key potentially in encrypted form to some trusted contact. And you want a trusted execution environment for that. You want something very non-hackable, something really out of reach, something that only provides this functionality and you cannot tamper with it. So some form of secure storage that would only run this kind of an algorithm. An additional benefit that we have some inquiries about, we didn't explore it thoroughly yet, is around jurisdiction and geographic diversification. So sometimes there are all kind of questions around regulations, legal questions that are related to a specific country where you operate. And it's interesting to think about space as something that kind of removes those barriers or takes you outside of this particular jurisdictions you're at. it's not necessarily that you're not under any jurisdiction, but you have potentially more flexibility. Often assets in space fall under the jurisdiction of the country from where the assets are launched. But there are many options to launch those satellites from. You can launch it from different countries, so that enables you to kind of diversify your exposure to regulations, choose some regulation that's more friendly to what you need to deploy. It's we're very early in understanding that and exploring that, and because it's a totally new setting, this combination of crypto and space is not really kind of on the radar of regulators. Nobody has really started thinking about it seriously, but it might become an interesting option for addressing those kind of questions, as well as just diversifying geographically, where it's not necessarily a regulatory concern. It's something related to, say, natural disasters, and just being outside of any specific geography where you want potentially validators or signers to be far enough apart from each other. So those are some additional benefits of this kind of a setting. That's pretty much it. Want to thank you, and I'll take questions.
Wow, that was interesting. Does anyone have questions already? Hello.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the interesting presentation. This may be a strange question, but I watch many sci-fi movies, and so I have to ask: what is the likelihood of someone actually being able to tamper with the satellite in space?
Yeah, so today it's kind of, I would say it's not realistic, to say the least. In movies, in Star Trek, wherever, Star Wars, you always see people docking, like spaceships docking to one another. It seems very easy. I guess the closest thing we have today is something like a docking to the International Space Station, which is a multi-million-dollar operation every time it happens, run by only certain nation states, right? It's a very complicated thing where the parties cooperate. It's a very complicated thing. Why? Because, for instance, a satellite in a low Earth orbit moves the speed of 7 kilometers per second. It's a pretty fast-moving thing, and to dock to it or to capture this kind of small object is really tricky. So it's basically sci-fi today. There are companies that are just starting to think about, say, clearing object in space because they're polluting. Some of the non-functional satellites are polluting near space, so there are ideas around clearing that, or towing satellites to returning the satellite that moved away from its orbit back to the orbit. It requires tremendous amounts of funding, and none of those companies deploy anything around it yet. They're just starting. So and all that is given that the other party cooperates with you, right? The satellite wants to be towed. When you don't want to collaborate, it becomes really sci-fi. The other thing is everything in near space is monitored. So you have different independent agencies. In the US, it's NORAD, North American Defense Agency, and they basically monitor every object in space down to very small sizes, like the size of a ball. So anything that would come close to your asset, to your payload, your satellite, would be noticed. And there are multiple non-colluding agencies. There's a Chinese one, there's a Russian one. They don't have interest to kind of collaborate to forge it. So you're really protected, at least at this point, in this regard.
Thanks.
One more question here. Two more.
Yes.
I heard another project which uses satellites and cryptography in space, and this was about quantum key distribution, I think, by the Chinese governments. Is there any similarities, or are you aware of the problems?
Not apart from the fact that it's something in space and it's related to cryptography. That's kind of where the similarity ends. Okay. So we're not dealing with quantum key distribution. We're relying, in all our comms, we're relying on kind of standard, state-of-the-art PKI. I guess quantum key distribution is, I guess the benefit there is some environment that's completely out of reach that can transmit it to points and share this key. It's not our second. we're using ECDSA, RSA,
how do you
like
communicate between the satellite and the ground stations?
Sorry, can you repeat?
How do you communicate? Is that radio wave communication or optical or what?
Yeah, it's ready at this point. It's what's called the S-band. There are also something that we're going to explore in the future, which is optical links, but that's really down the road. Because that's interesting, because that can get you to gigabits. Radio communication can provide tens of megabits of bandwidth, so not a bad start. Yep.
Hi, just a question from me.
Yes.
You mentioned the jurisdiction advantage with it being obviously in space. From these substations, is that multi-jurisdictional, or is that a denial of service vector if it's only, say, US? And then the second question was, in terms of kind of cost and bandwidth capabilities, what are you looking at for transaction signing per second, and is it something that limits it?
So I guess regarding the jurisdiction question, I'm not sure. I don't think people have seriously deeply thought about it, because there wasn't much of a need around that. So I'm not sure. Largely, the laws that are applicable to us as in space are usually related to the country where you launch for, or where the company operates, things like that. Maybe to come to kind of fill in as many details as I can on that part. In terms of our roadmap, we're thinking Web3, right? So it's not that a single entity controls the protocol or the assets. We want to actually decentralize it. So we're building technology, we're building designs that can be reference designs that can then be taken and implemented by other companies, by, say, our partners, to launch a decentralized constellation of satellites where we don't really control it, even from a kind of jurisdiction or controlling the asset standpoint. So that's a way to remove ourselves as a single entity that controls it. The second question was around bandwidth, right? Latency. We can eat as much as we will get. So at this point, and we have a progression from one payload to another. So with the first satellite, it wasn't very impressive. It's literally like kilobits per second, not too many windows per day. So a satellite needs to be within the reach of a ground station to be able to transmit. There are multiple across the globe, so you have a few windows a day. The second satellite is pretty similar. The third satellite actually has an S-band antenna, so whenever it's within the reach of a ground station, it can transmit quite a bit. It will be able to transmit hundreds of kilobits per second. There's some. That's just an anecdote. We had some firmware limitation there that will resolve only on the next version of the satellite. But that basically, that technology can take us to tens of megabits per second. We'll be happy to have as much as we can, because thinking of something like transaction signing, the more we can support, the better. The more we can handle with a single satellite. We can also address it with just having multiple satellites in the constellation that can be more accessible throughout the day and handle more transactions by just scaling it horizontally. So yeah, I hope that addresses it. Yes.
Hi. I had two questions actually this side.
Oh.
So yeah, first one is the same which this guy asked around the cost structure, or maybe the communication cost that would come with the while communicating with the satellite, because there has to be lots of to and fro with the ground station and the satellite to do the ECDSA transaction in an MPC setting, right? So that one is answered, by the way. But the second question is about have you guys looked into to check around the health of the share? Ultimately the share would has to reside inside a TE or any server, any computer system, basically. So are there any protocols or maybe some standard to see whether the shares are there intact, and we could use them for the transaction and the MPC protocols? Are there any standard around these to verify the health of the share, basically?
I'm not sure there's an answer that's any different than for any other TE than what you do. Basically, we're kind of this box that is flexible in terms of implementing, deploying any MPC protocol, right? We don't even really deal with that. We take existing protocols or whatever our partners or customers implement and deploy that. So I wouldn't expect us to do anything different than what you would do, say, with an enclave or something like that.
Yeah, I think makes sense, yeah.
In the interest of time, we have to cut down, I think, what looks like 4 more questions for you, Jan. So I hope that you look forward to getting hounded outside.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.